Good afternoon, everyone. We hope that you are having a wonderful day so far. We are thankful that so many of you all are joining us here at AARP Virginia for our virtual tour today and information session of the Maggie Walker House. My name is Carl Hamuel. I am the Community Outreach Director for Central Virginia. But right now, I'm going to turn things over to one of our wonderful volunteers here at AARP Virginia, Miss Pat Jones-Scott, to do our formal introduction. Ms. Pat, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Patricia Jones Scott, and I serve as a community ambassador for AARP Virginia. Thank you for joining our program this afternoon. Today marks the beginning of Black History Month. If you visit our website, you can see a listing of all the programs we have around the state in celebration of Black History Month. We began today learning about a pioneer in the Black community right here in Richmond, Virginia, Ms. Maggie Lena Walker. We have a representative from the Maggie Walker House located in Richmond, Virginia, here with us today that will help us learn. Part of the healthy aging is making sure that we continue to engage our minds as we age. At AARP Virginia, we not only have programs for Black History Month, but we promote and organize several programs that enrich the mind of the aging population and other workshops such as our 6 Pillars of Brain Health workshop that makes us aware of the importance of keeping our minds sharp. We are excited to learn and grow today, and we hope that you are too. Thank you again for joining, and without further ado, I will turn things over to our instructor for the afternoon. We hope you will all enjoy.
Hi, that was great. Thank you so much. Hello, AARP members. My name is Mark Wilcox. I'm one of the rangers for the Maggie Walker National Historic Site. I'm going to be turning this program over to my awesome co-worker, Ranger Ben Anderson, who, when it comes to giving tours, is about the best that we have. So what a great day you have for having a tour today. And I know that you haven't had a chance to see the film, introductory film of Mrs. Walker, and I wanted to give you just a little bit of information about who she was. Maggie Walker was born here in the Richmond, Virginia area back in 1864 when the Civil War is still raging. And of course, Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. She's mainly remembered as the first African-American woman in our nation's history to charter a bank and serve as that bank's president. And I had to look that up many years ago. Chartering a bank, that meant she filed the paperwork with the State Corporation Commission. And guys, she's doing this back in 1903. She is a woman of color. And think about, it was such a male-centric community, really throughout the South, male-oriented society. And she is also a woman of color during the Jim Crow era. So many different hurdles that were in front of her. But Maggie Walker was someone who never let those hurdles stop. I used to say that she used to jump over those hurdles, but I'm really now thinking that you just crashed right on through. You're going to find out that as you're going through the tour with Ranger Ben, we're going to be looking at doing a tour of the first floor of Mrs. Walker's home, that the bank was just really the tip of the iceberg. She would open a department store, a newspaper, but her main job was as a leader of a fraternal organization, the Independent Order of St. Luke. You're probably going to hear that name a couple of times. They sold insurance. She was the leader of that organization for the last 35 years of her life, incredibly successful in that role, and that would really define her career for the rest of her life. She bought this house. It's at 110 East Lee Street here in the Jackson Ward community of Richmond, Virginia. It was Richmond's largest predominantly African-American community after the Civil War. And you can see from Ranger Ben and myself, we've got photographs of Mrs. Walker, the front of her house. This is pretty much what you'd see if you were to come and visit us in person. She bought this house in 1904. She paid $4,800 for it. We have the original deed, and it has her name on it. Can you guess whose name is not on that deed? Right, her husband's name was not on the deed. Armstead Walker Jr. and his family ran a very successful brick contracting business here in the city, and yet he was not a co-owner or co-purchaser of this house. And I've always thought no matter what else Maggie Walker was doing with her career, providing a home for her family that no one was going to take away was paramount for her. And I think with that, Ranger Ben, if you are ready to go, we've got a really nice virtual tour of the first floor of the house, and he's going to go over that with you and tell you a little bit more about Mrs. Walker. So anytime you're ready to go, Ranger Ben, you can take off.
Thank you, Mark, for that. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Ms. Jones Scott and Ms. Harrison for having us. We're really thrilled to be here and help you all kick off Black History Month. It's certainly the beginning of a very busy and fun month for us. We're glad to share that with you today. So yeah, before we launch into the tour, of course, I wanted to, just as Mark did, kind of highlight the image that is right behind both of us, and that is the front of Maggie Walker's house. Because as great as this tour is, at least this virtual tour is that Google made for us, it doesn't begin with a shot of the front of the house, and so we do try to kind of use it and kind of as a reminder in some cases what we what you don't see. There's a lot of things we can see. We can zoom in close on things. We can even go kind of quote behind the ropes with the virtual tour as we have it, and which I'll do a couple of times today. But you don't see the front of the house. It starts kind of right on the inside of the door. So I want you all to see what visitors in person would see. When we would start a tour, you'd watch the film, and then we would take you around to the front of the house. And so your introduction would really start there. And one last thing before we head inside, Mark already mentioned, right, this is a home that was built in 1883. Maggie Walker buys it in 1904. It's where she spends her final 30 years. But one of the great things that we get to tell visitors about it is that after she passes away in 1934, members of her family continued living in the home for many, many years. In fact, it was Mrs. Walker's oldest granddaughter who actually ended up selling the home directly to the National Park Service. And this is back in 1979. So that, of course, is an explanation for why we are now have the honor of being the caretakers of her home. And not only were we lucky enough to get it directly from the family, as we soon discovered, the family had taken such good care of the house. We're able to tell visitors that over 90% of what's on display in the home is actually original to it, dates to Maggie Walker's time period. And so almost everything that we're going to be seeing as we kind of zoom through the house today are things that actually belonged to her. And that's a very unique, very rare claim for historic house museums. To say the least. So we're really lucky to be able to say both of those things. And we hope that those things really kind of help bring the home to life, especially once we go inside. The authenticity factor just being through the roof. Before we head inside, one last thing. This is a virtual tour that Google made for us back in 2015. Any of y'all who may be familiar with the Google Street View, if you've ever had to go online, look up an address using Google, and might see that there's actually a photograph of that address. That was a photograph that was created by a camera mounted on top of a car that Google sent down that street to take the photograph. And they're still doing that today. But in 2015, they actually, mounted that camera basically on a rolling cart and asked for some volunteers for some small museums around the country to let them bring that into the site. And take the same kinds of pictures, the same kind of 360-degree pictures that they take on the outside, and do that on the inside of the house. And we were lucky enough back in 2015 to be one of 12 museums in the United States to participate in that pilot program. And so we're going to be going through the house using those same little arrows and X's that you may be familiar with if you've ever used a street view before. And as Mark mentioned, we're only going to be seeing the first floor of the house. That has a lot to do with how kind of unwieldy this contraption was that Google brought to us back in 2015. And it just so happens that machine took a couple of unintentional selfies when it was in the house. So I'll be able to show that to you and talk about that as we go. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which is going to take us right inside the front hallway of Maggie Walker's home. All right. So is everyone inside the house with me?
Yeah, we're right there in the front parlor.
That is wonderful. All right. Well, welcome inside Maggie Walker's home. What I'm going to do is kind of zoom. I'm going to pan around here. And of course, we always have to be careful. We don't want to go too fast. As we like to say, we don't want to make anyone seasick when we do this. But the first thing I want to do is just simply to kind of pan back around this fuzziness, just part of the photograph that was taken. It's not anything on anybody else's end. But just to kind of, kind of get our bearings straight, this double entrance here is what we would have come in. If y'all were here in person, you would have come up those front stairs and through these double doors here. I probably would have been standing roughly where the camera is now, directing you into the first room here on your right, which is Maggie Walker's front parlor. So we're going to zoom in there real quick just to take a look around. All right, now that we're inside, I'm just going to pan around a little bit. I'm going to stop in a second here when we can see a lot of most of what's on display here. I'm going to pause here just so that we can, this is a really good view. Right now, what we're doing is kind of virtually standing in Maggie Walker's front parlor. We're looking back essentially north in the direction of her back parlor. And this is where we love to start our tours, because if you were a guest of Mrs. Walker's, this is where your visit would have started. She would have greeted you in these two rooms. And so this is a place where you can imagine a lot of visitors' first impressions were formed. And that's something that we like to think a lot about when we're taking folks to the house. We like to try to put ourselves in the shoes of someone visiting the house during Maggie Walker's time, try to imagine and think about what they're seeing and how they're reacting to what they're seeing. And I think one of the things that's always been very, I think, obvious and very clear and powerful to us is that visitors at that time were likely looking around and probably coming to the conclusion very quickly they've entered the home of someone who is very wealthy, right? That's very clear, especially with what's on display here in the parlors. But as Mark pointed out, right, the context of Maggie Walker's life is always critical to understanding the significance of what she achieves, right? Yes, she was wealthy, and she earned enough money to buy a really nice house and fill it with really nice things, but never forget, right? She is an African-American woman in the Jim Crow South, right? She's here in Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy during the height of the Jim Crow era. She buys this home long before women could vote. So again, when we think about how visitors might have reacted to what they're seeing here, there's a good chance, we think, that as they looked around, if nothing else, they understood how rare it was, right? To see evidence that this level of wealth and success was even possible, given who Maggie Walker was. So we'd love to imagine that folks were not only impressed by what they saw here in the front parlors, but also maybe left the house inspired too. We'd love to think that. So here in the back parlor, one of the neat things that you'll see here is this piano. It's a baby grand piano that Mrs. Walker purchased back in 1913. So it's here really for the last 20 years. She was here in the home. We often get the question, did she play the piano? And unfortunately, our answer to that is no, but just about everybody else in her family did. There was a very talented family as far as music was concerned. We know that she had two sons. Their names were Melvin and Russell. They were born before the family moved into the home, but they spent a lot of their formative years here at the house. We know they took piano lessons here. They eventually get married and have children of their own who they raise in the home. All four of their children together will take piano lessons. One of them takes violin as well. And back in the early 80s, when the park was preparing to open this site up to the public, one of the great things we got to do was sit down with all four of Maggie Walker's grandchildren and interview them about what it was like growing up here in the house. And so much of what they said to us, all the stories that they told, the details that they relayed, help explain why the house looks the way it does. But they talked a lot about that back room, saying that we could call it the back parlor if we wanted. But to them, it was the music room. It's where they practiced before going off to lessons. So really would have filled these spaces with a lot of wonderful sounds. But when they weren't practicing, this was also a very formal space within the house. They reminded us that as grandchildren, even as young children growing up here in the house, these were rooms that were generally off limits to them. So they had to kind of be invited into these spaces if they were going to spend time here. So this is a large home filled with a lot of family members, but some of these spaces were more formal than others. One other thing I wanted to focus on before we go, I'm going to kind of pan back around here to this last corner, is the combination of these two pieces here in the corner. That's this chair down here at the bottom, and then this photograph. Of course, as I mentioned just before we came in, the vast majority of what's on display in the house are original artifacts, things that were here during Maggie Walker's time. The chair that you see on display here is unfortunately not one of those pieces. This is one of the few exceptions to the rule. This is a piece that the Park Service had built to go on display. But we did base it. It looks the way it does for a good reason. We based it on a chair that we know Maggie Walker owned, which you can actually see in this photograph. Let me try to zoom in on it a little bit if I can. Actually, oh, there we go. Zoom in on the photograph here. So if you see, this is a photograph of Maggie Walker in that same corner. This is one of our favorite photographs. It's one of the few in our collection that was actually taken of her in the house, and it's the only one that we can actually pinpoint where in the house it was taken. And so because we know it was taken in that corner, we estimate around 1930 or so, we made the choice to kind of blow it up and put it in a frame and hang it on the wall there, just to bring that corner to life a little bit. So I'm going to zoom back out so you can see it once again, but obviously had a very similar chair. And one last thing about it, it's hard to notice from here, but the chair did have a special feature. It has wheels down here at the bottom. And the reason it has wheels is because Maggie Walker, for the last 7 years of her life, had to use a wheelchair to get around. So in addition to all these other obstacles that she's having to overcome throughout her life, being a woman of color in the Jim Crow South, she ends up having to overcome the physical effects of a disability that left her, essentially paralyzed from the waist down. She spent her final 7 years having to use a wheelchair to get around. And this chair has always struck us as really interesting because it's not like your conventional wheelchair, right, with the two big wheels on either side. But it was one that we think is possible may have been built to be comfortable and very stylish, but also possibly to maybe potentially mask her disability a little bit. If she didn't want that to be the focus of conversation, perhaps she was maybe a little worried that if people found out she was disabled, they might think less of her. We're not sure, but it's a really, really interesting design that we like to point out onto her. All right, we're going to head over across the hall to her library, but I did want to take a pause out here at the hall tree just to show you. This is really kind of the best kind of unintentional selfie that this contraption that Google brought us back in 2015 took. This hall tree here, of course, is an original piece, but here you get a good look at just how kind of tall and bulky this thing is. And so as soon as they brought it in the house, we knew there was really no way to get it up to the second floor here very safely, which is really the main reason why our tour today is just going to be limited to the first floor. If you do get a chance to come in person, which I hope you do, our tours in person do cover both floors. So that will be a little bonus for you to keep in mind. So today will kind of be more of a teaser, but really when all was said and done, we just knew we couldn't get up to that second floor very safely and take that thing with us. And so that's why we're only seeing the first floor today. All right, I'm gonna zoom in here to the library. And what I'm gonna do is kind of pan around here. This little X here at the front is usually where I stand giving tours. I bet Mark does too. I'm going to zoom over to that and then pan around so that you all can get a fuller view of the room from here. And once again, trying to go slowly so that you don't want anyone to get sick while they're with us. All right. Well, once again, this is Maggie Walker's library, another very public part of her house. So if you were visiting with her in person back in the 1920s and 30s, this is very much how the room would have looked. And this is a room that you likely would have spent time in. And again, when we think about how visitors are reacting to these spaces, what messages are these spaces sending to them about Mrs. Walker? I think a few things are worth pointing out in here. One is that we, of course, continue to see evidence of Mrs. Walker's wealth on display. So we think that, of course, is getting reinforced here in the library. But I think more importantly, we see her really kind of building on that in at least two ways. One is to say, look, I'm not just wealthy, but well-educated, right? Of course, we see that very dramatically through all of the books lining the west wall here. We have just under 600 of her books on display in original bookcases as well. But of course, as you can see above them as well, they're nicely complemented by degrees and diplomas earned by Mrs. Walker and other members of her family. So really making it pretty dramatically obvious just how high achieving the family was in an academic sense. We know if you ever get a chance to watch orientation film, it'll tell you a really fascinating story about Maggie Walker's graduation from high school here in Richmond back in 1883. And at that time, she graduates from what was then the only high school available to Black students in the entire city. It's called the Richmond Colored Normal School. But as it turns out, her future husband, Armstead Walker Jr., had graduated from the same school in 1875. His diploma is up there on the wall. We have their son Melvin's diploma graduating from the academy at Shaw University. That's in Raleigh, North Carolina. He does that in 1916. But as I like to say, of course, leave it to Mrs. Walker to outdo them all. We also have an honorary master's degree that she earned here in 1925 from Virginia Union University. And that's actually the one that I'm highlighting here at the moment, the one second from the right in this photograph. So an extraordinarily high achieving family as far as academics are concerned. And I think the importance of this, just to put it in context, Mrs. Walker's mother, Elizabeth, moves in with the family back in 1904, 1905, spends her final years here, passes away in February of 1922. But this is a woman born into slavery, someone who never learns to read or write her entire life. And here we get a really dramatic, very powerful sense of just how much a difference just one generation makes, right? So really, really fascinating context to put that in. The only other thing I like to point out in here, and it's hard to kind of see them all without zooming around, and I think maybe making some people a little uncomfortable stomach-wise, but are all of the faces that we see throughout the room. And I think since we're not going to zoom around and zoom in on a lot of them, you just have to take my word for it for now that most of the faces that we see throughout the room were of other famous African Americans from Maggie Walker's day. So it's kind of a who's who of that era. But as we like to stress to visitors who come to the site, most of them were people that Maggie Walker knew very closely, people that she worked with in a lot of interesting ways. In fact, we can also go one step further and say that many of them were guests at her home at one time or another. And that's true for folks like W.E.B. Du Bois, who co-founded the NAACP back in 1909. Booker T. Washington, we're pretty sure, visited the home on at least one occasion. You may have heard his name, founder of the Tuskegee Institute, fellow Virginian. The famous educators and activists, Mary McLeod Bethune and Annie Helen Burroughs, were both very close with Mrs. Walker. They both visited the home on numerous occasions. And we can even say, thanks to those interviews we did with Mrs. Walker's grandchildren, that the famous writers, County Cullen and Langston Hughes, came to the home in the 1920s. So two giants of the Harlem Renaissance. And so I always like to tell folks as they're going on tour with me in the home that we are adding our names to a really long and esteemed list of company Maggie Walker had with her in the home. And so we think this room really, if nothing else, enforces how wealthy Maggie Walker was, how well educated she was, and of course also how well known she was, how much of a national figure she had become. All right, what I'm going to do now, we're going to transition over to her dining room. I'm going to once again pan around just a little slowly so we can do this carefully. This is always a little bit of a tricky transition because it's such a tight curve. I'm going to zoom around and find my X. There it was. I just missed it. There we go. All right, so we're going to bust through some walls here. And here we are in the dining room. And this is really the first opportunity we get to kind of actually get a unique view of one of the rooms. If we were here in person, we'd actually be standing right here. It's kind of a small space that we're allowed to stand in behind ropes. We really can't get anywhere near this stuff. But because the virtual tour allows us to go beyond the ropes, I wanted to kind of zoom back here so we can actually talk about the dining room from a very unique perspective and really take advantage of that since this tour allows it. So I'm going to zoom back here and then pan around so we can see the room as we're talking about it. All right. Once again, going a little slowly. All right, so you see this little sharp turn here in the carpet. This is the area that we'd be forced to stand on if we were here. And it really only comfortably accommodates about 6-7 people at one time. So it's neat to be able to kind of step beyond the ropes with a much larger group like today and really see the room from this unique perspective. But here in the dining room, I always love to talk about again, going back to those interviews with Mrs. Walker's grandchildren, the park conducted back in the early 80s. One of the things that the grandkids really emphasized over and over again was, again, just how formal a space the dining room was. They said that just about all of their day-to-day meals were in the kitchen. We'll actually pause in there in just a minute. The dining room as we see today was really only reserved for special occasions, when the entire family, those rare occasions, I'm sure as some of you can relate, when everybody in the family just happens to be around, or maybe it's a big holiday like Thanksgiving or Christmas. We know they certainly had meals here, or of course when Mrs. Walker's hosting one of those famous visitors that we talked about, they would be dining in here. But as far as day-to-day meals go, this room, according to the grandchildren, was really not used in that way. This is a much more formal space than that. But as far as the artifacts go, this is one of the more authentically restored rooms in the house. I always love to stress that on tour. So as we look around, we are seeing the original table in china. We have the original chandelier as well. All of the display cabinets that we see throughout the room are original, including their contents. All of the silver, all of the crystal that we see belong to Mrs. Walker. The mantle back here in the left corner is original. And I also like to point out the ceiling. This is one of the more unique decorative features in the house, because what we're looking at here is actually a ceiling made out of tin. It's metal. But we believe very strongly that this was painted on purpose to fool the eye in order to look more like plaster or marble. And we think that's true because we know that during Maggie Walker's time, it was a very common trend, especially in wealthy homes, to have things on display that were made to look like things they weren't. And so there was a trend of false surfacing or faux finishing, as you could say, going on during Maggie Walker's time. So it's neat to be able to point out an example of that on tour. Always especially fun to do when we have young kids on tour, because their creative brains get going, and we love to hear all the different guesses they have of what material that is before we tell them. But that's certainly a neat feature of the house. All right, our next stop is the den. I'm going to zoom back over here to the carpet, and then make our way here into the den. Once again, kind of panning around slowly. I have to bust through these walls here briefly, but there we go. And like the library, what I'm going to do is pan around again. I'm going to go to the top of the room where you see this X, and then I'm going to pan around so we can see it from the kind of ranger perspective in a way. All right. So here we are now in a space that the family referred to as Melvin's den. Melvin, as it turns out, was the youngest of Mrs. Walker's two sons. Her oldest son was named Russell. But again, when we were sitting down with Mrs. Walker's grandchildren back in the early 80s, these were Melvin and Russell's children. One of the other things they made very clear to us on tour was that this room was used more by Melvin than anyone else. He would invite friends of his back to the house. They would gather here, entertain themselves, have a lot of fun listening to music and playing cards and things like that. And so I sometimes joke with visitors on tour that none of the grandkids called this the man cave of the Walker house, but it certainly, given the way the grandkids described it, it kind of brings up similar uses kind of in our mind. So certainly a much less formal room than what we've seen so far. So when we imagine, again, being here as a visitor during Maggie Walker's time, if we were here as a guest of Melvin's, stepping into this room, especially from the dining room, was probably the first time you felt like maybe you could loosen that tie, roll up those sleeves a little bit and maybe start to relax some. But of course, the pieces that really kind of hint at its use as an informal space are these two here in the back. I'm going to zoom up a little closer to them so we can see them better. Of course, the first is here on the left. This is what the Walkers would have called a Victrola, and a very fancy one for the time period. This is a very expensive late 1920s model. As you can probably see from this angle, it has a combination record player and radio feature, so very high end and very fancy. And I love to tell folks, again, especially younger folks on tour, this is about as modern an in-home entertainment system as Maggie Walker ever lives to see. In fact, if we were to go back in time and meet her in the house and say, hey, this is a wonderful house, but where's your TV? She'd give us a very funny look. She'd have no idea what we're talking about, right? Televisions really don't start to become a part of the American home for another 20 years or so after she dies. And so radio is about as modern as it gets. But it was really exciting to have a radio in your home. It was such new technology. It really connected people to the outside world. in a way that we're now very much used to with our phones and computers and TVs, but it was a very new kind of experience back then. So hearing that, someone who you're visiting had a radio was a pretty exciting prospect. Of course, there's a bar here to the right. There's a card table down here. So all telltale signs of a much less formal space. I'm going to circle back around so we can see the rest of the room just to make one final point about this space. And that is that this room is actually not original to the house. And if you were here in person, you might have sensed that a little bit. There's a little bit of a downward slope on the floor. The room itself is fairly narrow and long. It's kind of an odd shape. A lot of times the first big giveaway is those windows here to the right that are from the dining room. But what that tells us is that back in 1904, when Maggie Walker buys this home, this room was not here at all. This was an outdoor porch. In fact, this wall here along the right, this is the east wall. This was actually the original exterior wall. But what happens over time is that the Walker family grows, right? As I mentioned before, her two boys, Melvin and Russell, get married, have children, raise them in the house. In addition to them, Mrs. Walker had an adopted daughter named Polly Payne. She marries a man named Maurice. They live in the house. Mrs. Walker's mother is also in the house. And so right around 1920 or so, the family will peak at about 12 people here in the home, but also spread out across 4 generations. And so makes it really easy, once again, when we imagine what it was like in the home during Maggie Walker's time, to really kind of, imagine how noisy, how crowded things got, especially during the late teens and early 20s. But this is that large, close-knit family environment that Mrs. Walker really wants. So much so that as her family grows, rather than asking them to leave, or waiting for them to say, oh, it's a little too crowded in here, I might need to move out, Mrs. Walker decides to go ahead and expand the house. She wants to keep pace with the family so that nobody has to leave. And in the end, she was successful at that. She does get this large, close-knit, multi-generational family environment here at the home. But in order to get it, she had to expand the home considerably. So between 1918 and 1922, she makes some major additions. She encloses the porch, giving us the den as we know it today. By the end of 1922, almost every square foot of what we're going to be seeing for the rest of the tour was also added on by Mrs. Walker as well. So a nice kind of physical reminder of how dedicated she remained to her family, even in the context of a very busy and demanding professional career, running this national fraternal order, managing these businesses. A lot easier said than done. All right, we're going to head to the kitchen next. Zoom right over there and then head to the kitchen. Zoom in there once again, and I'm going to pan over once again so everyone can see everything. And then zoom out once again, see if I can zoom out a little further. There we go. All right. So here we are in the kitchen. Hopefully everyone had a good lunch. All we have here is, of course, some fake fruit, which you can't touch, which is no fun. But in a lot of ways, right, I think we're looking at really the beating heart of the house in so many ways. When we think back on how the grandchildren described this space, this is where almost every day-to-day meal was held. Of course, we're looking at the original table and chairs, but as you can tell, obviously not something designed for a family of 12. And so I think, we're allowed to kind of start imagining people coming and going, right, eating in shifts. I mean, just a real beehive of activity on any given day, especially during those peak family years of the late teens and early 20s. Always high up on the list of best places to have been a fly on the wall in my view from back then. But getting to witness all of that activity here in the kitchen is actually this piece here on the left. This stove, we think, is one of the oldest original pieces in the entire house. So we remember when Maggie Walker buys this home back in 1904, she was the third owner of the house. There have been 2 different Black doctors who lived here before her. The doctor who lived here right before the Walkers, his name was Robert Jones, and he makes some additions to the house himself, one of which was the addition of the kitchen. He has that built on to add to the rest of the home that had been an outbuilding prior to that time, but he has it added on to the home. And we think that he likely had that stove installed. So when we take people on tours of the house, we like to point at that stove and say, this is one of the few things we can point out on tour that we think was right there in that same spot the entire time Maggie Walker lived here. And we can't say that about even all the rest of the original pieces, which tend to date to the final 10 to 15 years of her life. But that stove, boy, got to overhear a lot of what I'm sure were really interesting conversations there in the kitchen. So it's fascinating to think about all the sights and sounds it witnessed, not to mention smells that it produced. My goodness, this was probably the place to be. Back then. And one of the neatest stories we have about this room, once again, comes from those grandchildren who remembered an afternoon, we think in the summer of 1928, 1929, Maggie Walker sitting around this very table with her close friend, Mary McLeod Bethune, Langston Hughes, and County Cullen. And to date, it's the only source we have that all four of them were in this home at one point together. And so we'd love to know more about what they're talking about, what kind of brought them here, and what they discussed during their meeting. We probably will never know any more about that, but just really fascinating to think about what a brain trust that was right there at that very table. The stove knows, but we probably never will. All right, so we're gonna have to kind of put on our crash helmets one more time in order to get to the laundry room. As you can kind of see here, as we go out of the kitchen, it is a real hard, sharp right here to the right. So normally you would come out and take that right. We're gonna crash to the walls here. So put on those helmets, because here we go. Oh, okay. All right, so here we are. We've just left the kitchen. And in doing so, we've actually entered the newest part of the home. This whole rear section here that we've just entered was added on by Mrs. Walker back. It was completed, we know, by the end of 1922. And we're now looking inside a laundry room that was part of that big addition. And suffice it to say, 100 years ago, it was rare to have a laundry room in your home, let alone one this large. So even though, of course, to a lot of visitors today, we're looking at a space that looks anything but modern, right? This is going back in time to when laundry was being done by hand, which it was, which was common to do throughout Maggie Walker's life. We don't really start to get washing machines and dryers until a little bit later. But as maybe antiquated as this looks, this was a very modern type of space to have for anyone. And we'd like to think, for Maggie Walker really held a lot of very special significance. We know that as she grew up here in Richmond, right, she goes on to a very, very successful and wealthy career, but her life didn't start out that way, right? Remember, her mother was born enslaved. She was working as a cook at the time Maggie Walker was born, and really will work for the rest of her life in some various capacities. But one of the jobs that her mother had was doing laundry for wealthy white families here in Richmond. And Maggie Walker will later go on to say in her diaries that helping her mother with laundry was one of her earliest memories growing up in Richmond. And of course, back in the 60s, 1860s, 1870s, this was grueling work. This, we're lucky, I think, to be so far removed from it as we are now with washing machines and dryers doing all of the hard work for us. But back then, everything had to be done by hand. It was extremely time consuming, very physical labor. Maggie Walker, of course, knew that very, very intimately. And so by the time we get here to 1922, when she invests a lot of her money in this very large, very modern space, it's tempting to think that, she's doing this. She's using her money very consciously to make a job that she remembered being very difficult, much easier for that next generation. All right, we've only got one more room to see before we wrap up. What I'm going to do is zoom here to the corner right in front of this door. And instead of going into the room right away, there's a special secret to this room that is kind of on display for us if we were to go in there right away. And I kind of want to hype it up a little bit. This is what we're able to do on tour. But in a minute, we're going to head in there. And you might be a little shocked to see this is a room that, unlike the rest of the house so far, is very bare. There's no furniture in there whatsoever, but there's a good reason it looks that way, and that is because after having started off as a bedroom for Maggie Walker's adopted daughter, Polly, it transitions into a playroom for Mrs. Walker's grandchildren sometime in the mid to late 1920s. And when we're interviewing them in their early 80s, asking them about how each of the rooms looked in the house, they actually clarified for us that the playroom was essentially kind of a wide open space during their childhood. And so the park, I'm sure, if it had a face, started to smile very widely when it heard that, because it meant that, you know, we get to have an empty room be authentic. Not too many historic house museums get that option. So it meant not that we get to avoid a lot of like hard decisions and having the creative solutions, you know, for what to do with this otherwise empty space. We can leave it as is, and it's the way the grandkids remembered it. But there is a special feature to this room, and again, this goes back to Maggie Walker's and the onset of her disability in the late 1920s. So if you can remember all the way back to the front parlor, right, when we looked at that rolling chair in the front parlor, as a reminder that once again, she spends her final 7 years having to use a wheelchair to get around. We know that she suffered from diabetes as an adult. It's possible that maybe led to the onset of her disability. We're not entirely sure. But once her disability set in, she had some big decisions to make, one of which was what to do with her bedroom, because that had always been on the second floor of the house. And as she was kind of contemplating what to do about that, she had to decide, well, she could either move down here or do something much more interesting. And I think you all can probably sense where we're going with this. And that is to say she did something much more interesting. And that was to have an elevator installed. Of course, I can't see any of your faces, but I imagine if I were to ask you all to raise your hand, if you know someone with an elevator in your house, I wouldn't see too many hands. They're still, of course, very rare, very expensive for a reason that has not changed over the years. Two have raised their hands. That's great. So you are an elite few of the two of you. I am not among them. I've never known anyone with an elevator in their house. But one of the things that I think is really neat about the elevator that we can't really see on this tour is that just inside up at the very top is a stamp reminding us this was not just any elevator, but an Otis elevator. And anybody familiar with that company, that goes back to the 1800s. It's still around today. So next time you get into a modern elevator, check it out. There's a good chance that it's an Otis elevator. So a real top of the line piece then, as it is today. And to kind of wrap it up, obviously this is a great symbol of her wealth. But as you might suspect, with an elevator that is quickly approaching its 96th birthday, this elevator operated very differently than elevators today. Mrs. Walker did not have the luxury of just pressing a button and being carried away by an electrified machine. Instead, this operated by hand using a rope and pulley system. And thanks to her grandchildren, once again, we know that Mrs. Walker had a chauffeur named Alfonso Robinson, who was the main operator of the elevator. So they said he would roll her in there and he would step in, grab a hold of the rope that is just inside here to the right, and pull on it to get both of them up to the second floor. So pretty remarkable thing to think about. And just to kind of wrap up before we get to some questions, I hope you have some. I think when we have to end tours here at the elevator, it's too bad, but this is always a great piece, though. It's a great piece to go out on because not only, as I mentioned, is it a great symbol of her wealth, it also, I think, helps to remind us of something so critical to who Maggie Walker was, and that was just an incredibly kind of innovative and determined problem solver, right? As someone who encountered as many obstacles as she did over the course of her life, being Black, being a woman in the South with a disability, she was no stranger to having to come up with solutions to all sorts of problems. And one thing that we see, students of her life see over and over and over again, is when these obstacles appear, she does anything but step away and hope that someone else kind of comes in and solves it for her. Her approach was to confront these things directly and come up, and she often came up with a very bold and effective solution very quickly. And so kind of helps, we know that she did that with the elevator after her disability sets in January of 1928. This elevator was up and running by March. And so it gives you a pretty good sense, I think, of just the kind of person that she was, someone who was just a real go-getter, someone who was about as determined and intelligent and as much of a go-getter as you were ever likely to meet. So that is going to do it for me. I hope you all enjoyed the tour. I hope you all had some questions as well, because at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I'm going to rejoin you in the meeting, and then we'll take any questions you all have. All right. So, yeah, you're welcome. I see from CIS to everyone, thank you for this virtual tour. You're more than welcome. Very, very glad to have led it today. Oh, okay. So we see a few there in the chat. They're coming maybe a little faster than I can see. Mark, can you pull up a few and
I was just about to jump on and ask him, but if you're good, Mark, that works for me.
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, actually, we've been pretty busy. This is a great group. We've had the Q&A section that have been going strong with some really great questions, and I've been trying to keep up with the chat as well. And I'm looking at our last question that I was, how old was Mrs. Walker when she was passed away? She was 70 years old in 1934 when she passed.
70 and 5 months exactly. She was born July 15th, 1864. She dies December 15th, 1934. So 70 and 5 months to the day.
And you know what? They laid her out in that front parlor, that very first room that Ranger Ben took you through, and people came in the front door, and they would pay their respects, and they moved to the back parlor, across the hall, back to the library, and out through a separate entrance there. And Mrs. Walker's youngest granddaughter's name was Elizabeth Randolph, who just passed away herself about 90 years old at 9 years ago. And she remembered sitting on those front stairs for hours and just watching one person. Thousands of people came through, and really just understanding how important grandmom was to the people in this community. And they moved her body from that front parlor to her church building, First African Baptist Church. The building is still there on our Broad Street here in Richmond. And it was December the 19th. It was a cold, nasty, rainy December day. And you know that people came out by the thousands and lined Lee Street just to pay their respects to Mrs. Walker as the car carrying her remains passed by. And just really shows you what a testament that was to who she was in this community and this city, and the respect that she won for herself.
Yeah. I saw one question in there. How did she amass her wealth? And that's a really interesting question that, we get often. It's a good one. And it's one I wish we could answer a little bit better. But unfortunately, we're a little bit limited in the sense that Maggie Walker's financial records did not survive. So we do not, we can't go back to those and really get a sense of, exactly how much she was getting from this and that. I can say that when she passes away in 1934, what we do see, right, we finally get everyone kind of for the first time kind of gets a look at what comprised her estate, right, which kind of gives us a real good insight, I think, to how she at least invested her money, which I think helped her amass wealth at the same time. But what we see in 1934 is a really kind of what we would call a diverse portfolio, in the sense that she had a lot of her wealth spread out really across the insurance industry. She had a lot of policies in multiple insurance organizations and fraternal organizations. She had a lot of stock in various banks. And she owned a lot of real estate. In fact, at the time she passed away, she owned a dozen houses here in Richmond, and she was actually able to will them, some of them directly to her grandchildren. All of her grandchildren, her adopted daughter Polly, all got houses in the will, and so she was able to certainly at least make sure that the next generation got a little bit of a head start in a way financially, which we know they appreciated. But yeah, I would say the majority of her wealth likely came from, I think, some of that income that she had as she invested. Built her wealth, invested in real estate, but also from the salary she was receiving from the Independent Order of St. Luke. And I wish we knew more about how much that was, but we just don't. Unfortunately, we know that it was a pretty good amount, but how much exactly we just don't. All right, another question.
One that I
Um,
saw in the chat for you was,
yeah.
are there any recommendations for titles of good biographies about Miss Walker?
Another great question. Yes and no, almost in a sense. Yes, and there absolutely is. There's a great biography out there. It's a book called A Right-Worthy Grand Mission. It's by a woman named Gertrude Woodruff Marlowe. And I don't know, Mark, if you want to maybe put maybe the title or something like that in the chat so that people can see it. But this
Sure.
is a book. In fact, when the park was first starting out in the early 80s, it recognized that, it was honored, I think, to be the next generation of folks who shared Maggie Walker's story with the public, but it also recognized she wasn't as much of a household name as some of her contemporaries. And so they've kind of felt in some ways they were starting from scratch with kind of knowledge about her life. And so they actually went to Howard University and worked out an agreement to have one of their professors write a biography of Maggie Walker. And the idea was that this book would be done by the time the house was open to the public so that the Rangers could base their tours on the best available information. Well, we got a professor to write the book, but instead of it being done by the time the first tours started in 1985, the book doesn't get published until 2003. And hopefully that's enough to let you know there's a very interesting story about what happens in between. Obviously, a lot of delays there, but nevertheless, it's a great book. It's been our Bible really over the years. I think now, having continued to learn about her story, we could maybe update it in some ways here or there. The unfortunate thing is that it's hard to find now. Because the Howard University Press, which published the book in 2003, went under in 2011, and no other press actually picked up that title. So no one is actively publishing it. If you live in the Richmond area, you can find it hopefully at a branch of the Richmond Public Library. We know the local colleges, Virginia Union, VCU, University of Richmond, all carry copies. You might find one on Amazon, although a few of the copies I've seen not too long ago, some of them had really inflated prices. I think the news has maybe kind of trickled down to the folks selling on Amazon that it's kind of a collector's item at this point. So you might see some kind of really inflated prices there. But if you get a chance to get a hold of that book, that'd be a great one. We also, it's going to be a long-term project, but we're also starting to work with other professors now to kind of maybe update Marlowe's book and maybe investigate, do we write a whole new one? Do we have a brand new one kind of all written, or do we kind of maybe have an updated version? We hope to have a better answer to that in the next year or so, but we're actively seeking qualified writers as we speak.
Well, and also, guys, don't I'm answering another question in the Q&A, but don't be discouraged if you go to Amazon. As Ranger Ben said, you might see, I put the name of the biography in the chat there, A Right-Worthy Grand Mission, Maggie Walker and her quest for Black economic empowerment. You might see it for $300. Check again the next week. I've seen them for $30. It just depends. So it is our Bible and at our park here. So I recommend just kind of checking it out. Just waiting for the right deal to come along, because I think that it will.
Yeah.
And the last question that I'm seeing right now came in our Q&A, and it is, was there any relationship between Maggie Walker and Madam C.J. Walker, another prominent entrepreneur?
Oh man, yeah, that is another very great question we get, and
we get
as
that
it
a
turns
lot.
out, yeah, we get that all the time, and the answer to that is very simply no. There was no relation. Both of them marry into Walker families that, as far as we know, were not related to each other. So you had Sarah Breedlove, who marries a gentleman with the last name Walker. I forget his first name at the moment, but she, of course, goes on to become Madam C.J. Walker through that. And then Maggie Walker, who starts off as Maggie Draper, and then Maggie Mitchell, and then marries Armstead Walker Jr. So they were not related in any way. It is really just one of those funny little historical coincidences where you have, you just happen to have two very successful Black female entrepreneurs coexisting at a time when you wouldn't think there would be that many hanging around. but and of course, and with such similar names. So we get that a lot. A lot of folks come in thinking about that and thinking they're actually taking a tour of Madam C.J. Walker's house. Well, oftentimes we'll nip that in the bud. We have had a few people over the years watch the film, do the whole house tour, and then afterwards tell us, "Oh, that was a great tour, but what about the hair care products? You didn't mention."
Yeah, you never mentioned the hair
Madam
care
C.J.
product.
Walker became famous for selling, cosmetics, right? Yeah, skin products and hair products, and but we know they knew each other. They were both active in some of the same organizations, the National Association for Colored Women, for instance. They both overlapped there. We haven't yet, as odd as it may sound, we have not yet put them in the same room at the same time. They kind of historically still appear to be kind of ghosts in the night as far as that goes. But they certainly knew who each other were. After Madam C.J. Walker dies in 1919, Maggie Walker was one of the many who who sent in her sympathy card to the family and remained close with Madam C.J. Walker's daughter, Alelia, for years. And so it's possible there was a deeper connection there that we know about at the moment. But yeah, not related by family, but just a coincidence.
The civil rights community, it was a small community. I think most people knew each other. And I put this in the Q&A that in the 19-teens, Mrs. Walker and her daughter-in-law, Hattie Walker, actually worked together successfully to save the Frederick Douglass House that sits outside Washington, D.C. today. And my understanding is that one of, if not the largest donor to that enterprise was Madam C.J. Walker. So they absolutely had to have known of each other, and probably did know each other. We've got nothing to show it in writing yet.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. I don't know if any of y'all have ever visited the Frederick Douglass House. It's another unit of the National Park Service, but historically, it's one of the reasons it's here is because of Maggie Walker and the activism of the National Association for Colored Women. It passed on to his widow after Frederick Douglass died, and when she had some difficulty paying the bills, she enlisted the help of Frederick Douglass Literary and Historical Society. When they ran into problems paying the bills, they offered to sell it to the National Association of Colored Women. I think this is in 1915 or 16. And the NACW's response was to at least initially form an exploratory committee of 7 women, Maggie Walker was one of them, that were tasked with going to kind of investigate and see, is this something worth buying? And as you can imagine, this is probably a formality for them. The answer was a resounding yes. And so the NACW does indeed. It launches a national fundraising campaign, pays off the mortgage in 2 years, actually. In 1918, when the NACW meets in Denver, they celebrate by burning the mortgage, and thanks in large part, as Mark said, to a massive donation from Madam C.J. Walker that helped get him over there. So it's one of the most direct kind of core combinations where we can actually have Maggie Walker and Madam C.J. Walker kind of active in the same issue. But yeah.
Well, thank you, Ranger Ben, and thank you, Ranger Mark. We truly appreciate you. In the interest of time, we apologize if we did not get to every question, but we thank you for your interaction. We thank you for your engagement, and we thank Ranger Mark and Ranger Ben for your time today, sharing with us. Before we close out, do you have anything that you all want to add?
Well, come see us. We are open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 4:30. We offer public tours at 10 a.m., 11 a.m., 1, 2, and 3 p.m. That include a viewing of our orientation film and then tour of Maggie Walker's house, which is right around the corner from our visitor center. So look us up. Our website, where you can also see the film, is www.nps, as in National Park Service, .gov. That's GOV. And then /MAWA. So check us out, come see us. And perhaps the best thing that never gets old for us to say is that this is free. This is your tax dollars at work. Assuming you paid your taxes, you're paying our salary. So come on and enjoy it, take advantage. We love what we do, and we'd love to see you in person if we can.
And guys, if you truly love history, there's nothing like being in the space. And when I walk through the halls of this house, honestly, I feel like the family's still there. They've just stepped out of the room for a moment, and you can learn so much about it. And it was a family that, in preserving this house, knew they were preserving the stories of the people who lived there. So yeah, if you get a chance, and come visit us, because as you can tell, we don't like to talk.
Right. especially true for me and Mark. But yes, thank you, Carl. Thank you, Raven. Thank you, Pat Jones, Scott. We really appreciate you inviting us. We had a wonderful time.
And thank you again so much. And thank you all for joining us today. It's been a great session. Again, part of healthy aging is making sure that we continue to learn, continue to engage our brains. And we did that this afternoon with this history lesson. Such an important topic, and we thank each and every one of you for joining us. Don't forget that if you by chance missed a portion, a recording will be emailed to you for all of those who registered this afternoon. Once again, we thank you for joining us on behalf of AARP Virginia. We appreciate your presence this afternoon. We thank Ranger Ben. We thank Ranger Mark just one more time. We appreciate all of you all, and we hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your evening. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.